Good morning. It's great to have you guys here as we kick off our brand new series, our Easter series that we're calling Dirt Nap. Now, for some of you, you're like, listen, Rob, you can't fool me with those bright blue skies and sort of the nice green grass. We know what a dirt nap is, and no pretty graphic is going to make us get excited about taking a dirt nap, right? Because like we have people taking dirt naps, it seems like on either side of the stage during this series, and you're like, dirt naps, right? Like the idea of death is one of the top three things most people try to avoid at all costs, right? And so I don't know about this, but let me tell you, here's what I think. I believe that if you engage in this series, you are going to love it. I really believe that this week and this month is going to be helpful for us. I think it's going to give us something, not only that we need to hear and learn, but that pretty much everybody on planet Earth needs to do a better job of living, right? Because there's this problem, there's this issue, there's this deficiency. And it's really about how in the ridiculous pace of this planet, you and I can actually experience Sabbath and rest. Now, some of you are like, that sounds great, but I don't believe you, right? Let me give you just a little bit here. So this journey for me started last summer when I read this book entitled Rest. And this is not a Christian book. It's not written by a Christian author, but it was really, really helpful. Subtitle, When You Get More Done When You Work Less. You're like, huh? That doesn't sound right. That doesn't work that way in my life. And then it's funny how this is showing up everywhere. National Geographic had an issue that was their sleep issue and talked all about rest. So I picked that up and read that. And then read scholar Walter Brueggemann's book, Sabbath as Resistance. And then for an older book and a different book, The Sabbath, written by Abraham Joseph Heschel, who, when he was alive, was one of sort of the foremost rabbis. And then kind of a newer, more popular book, Subversive Sabbath. The surprising power of rest in a non-stop world. So I have been reading and have read all these books, and you guys can be thankful, because what I want to do is not over the next 4 weeks share everything that I learned and read in 6 or 7 books, and just pack it all into 4 3-hour messages. No, we're not doing that. But I want to share 4 simple thoughts, because again, I think for most people here, this is what we think. This idea of rest is great, but it's just not possible for me. It's just not possible for me. Some of us believe that for right now, right? For this season of life, I have kids, I have this or that or whatever, so it's not possible right now. But if we're being honest, some of us have even taken that next step, and we've come to believe that it's not possible for us ever, right? It's not possible for us at all. In fact, we've all heard this, we've thought it, we've felt it. Some of us have even said these words when it comes to this idea of any sustained and consistent rest and relaxation, right? We say this, I will rest, keyword, after I am dead. Have you ever heard that? Have you ever felt that? Some of us maybe even have actually uttered those words, right? We have said that. And if you're here today, and for you, what hits your mind is, Rob, it's not quite that bad. Let me ask you this. Have you ever been in a season of life where it just seemed like everything was nonstop, and you told yourself, if I can just get to this point, things will slow down? Has anyone ever done that? Only to get to that point and then do it all over again. Well, at this point, if I just make it here, it's like a moving fixed point. but it never changes. We continue to pack our lives full of activity and people and stuff and things. And the problem is that this goes on and on and on and on in a never-ending way. This is the problem we're going to deal with and talk about and offer help for these 4 weeks. But we've got to stop saying those words, right? I'll rest after I'm dead, right? Well, I can't wait till I get there, then I'll finally have a break, right? We've got to stop saying this. We've got to stop thinking this and feeling this and believing this. And especially, we have got to stop living this way. Because we have the antidote. Just like I gave you the problem, right? We're all exhausted because we live in such a non-stop, fast-paced, hectic world that we all sort of buy into and lean into. I also want to give you the solution here in the first few minutes, and it's just a few statements that really are the centerpiece of these whole 4 weeks. One is this: Jesus died. Jesus died. 2 is He defeated sin and death. And then 3 is because of that, now you and I can rest, and we can rest now. So look at the series graphic. Let's go to the next one. Look at this again, and tell me if it doesn't hit you differently, right? Like we all thought we were stuck in this life, right? That we were just going to have to stay trapped in this perpetual, ongoing rat race and live lives where we're always exhausted until we die and can finally get some rest. But instead of that, God died. He died for us. And His death paid for everything. It paid the price for everything. He accomplished everything. But He didn't just die like we all die, right? He didn't just make some grandiose claims and at some point kind of get over the hump and sort of diminish somewhat until poof, He was no more. He didn't die like us. He actually died and then came back to life. This is what we're going to celebrate in a couple weeks. And it's going to be incredible. Right? Anyone else believe that? Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. I was starting to wonder if you guys had the cardboard cutout thing going on again. So He defeated sin and death. And so that you and I, right, we do not have to die in the same way. We do not have to live in the same way in these same perpetual broken patterns because of what He did and accomplished. If we receive these things, right, you and I, we can actually begin to rest in the here and the now and experience life in a brand new way. Now, some of you are thinking, yes! And others of you are a little bit more skeptical, maybe a little more savvy, and what you're thinking is, Rob, that sounds great, but is that one of those really cool sounding things that pastors say? But when I really evaluate it, I start to wonder, but how do I actually practically apply that to my life now? Right? Because I like what you're saying, I just don't know that it's possible for me. I don't really believe that can happen for me. So here's what we're going to do. Today, I just want to lay a little bit of a foundation for us. And it's going to be a biblical foundation. And then next week, I want to give you the keys to the kingdom in terms of this issue. Like if you're like, I really am tired of being tired, I'm tired of being exhausted, and I would love to experience more deep, transformative rest in my life. Next week is the key. And I'm not just we're going to look at some scriptures too, but I'm not just going to tell you biblical things next week. I want to give you examples based in math and science and history so that you and I can see practical examples over and over and over again that we can actually live life doing less and accomplishing more. Doing more, like we think, does not get us more. Doing less gets us more, and we're going to see that. And then in 2 weeks, which is Easter Sunday, see, next week's about giving us the keys to this kingdom, but Easter is about seeing this work finished, not just for you and me, but for other people. You have friends. You have coworkers. You have neighbors. You have acquaintances who are exhausted and are in desperate need and may never, ever, ever know what Jesus can do for them and with them and in them and through them unless you are willing to invite them to come here. And so I want to encourage you guys. We've had these cards out, these little invite cards out on the seats. We put more out after the first gathering. Listen, 2 weeks from now is not just, it's our Super Bowl and we're going to sing even more songs and it's going to be fun and we're going to do cool stuff. Yeah, we're going to do all that. But it's not about that. If you just come and have a great weekend and then go home, like, so what? Right? This is about us helping other people who desperately need to know Jesus experience Him so this can be a finished work in their lives as well. And so please, as you leave today, don't just grab one invite card. Take every invite card. Take every one at the hub and at the holders by the entryway doors. We will literally kill every tree in Mohican to print more of these so you can let people know about Jesus. Some of you are like, that doesn't sound very Jesus. Listen to my heart, not my words. And then the last week is really cool because the last week we're going to talk about how you and I, even just after these 4 weeks, can actually live out this kind of life that is more sustainable and has deep rest to it so that we're not just, we talked about it and that was cool, and then we're just going to jump back into business as usual. We're going to talk about how we can keep living this out. So again, today we're going to set a foundation, and as we do that, I want to talk to you around this idea of rest redefined. Rest redefined. In order for us to redefine it, it would make sense that we start by defining it, right? And so I want us to have this starting point, this collective starting point that we can build on together a little bit today, but really for the rest of this series. Because that word, rest, is a pretty common word, right? But there's another word that is not as common anymore, and that word is Sabbath, right? Sabbath. We don't use that one as much. So I want to start in an old place today. And I want us just to look at 2 verses. That's it. One verse from the first couple chapters of the very first book of the Bible, and one verse from the third book of the Bible. And the reason is because I want us to see what God's plan, what God's intent was in the very beginning, right? Before sin, before the fall, what was God's intent for how things were to function? What was God's intent for us? And then I want us to look not just there in Genesis, but also in Leviticus, so that we can see even after the fall, even after things were broken, what God's ongoing intent was in terms of how we lived life in this area. And so we're going to see where things started and some of the ways I think that we have missed the point. So here we go. Check out Genesis chapter 2, verse 3. Genesis 2:3 says this. Then God blessed the 7th day and made it holy, because on it He rested from all the work of creating that He had done. So in the pattern of creating the world, God gives us these 2 things, right? This pattern of work and rest. You work and then you rest. And in fact, this was before man and woman were created. This is before Adam and Eve, just before Adam and Eve came on the scene. So God established this pattern, and here we see God Himself doing this, right? God Himself says, I spent 6 days making things, 6 days creating, and then He says, I rested. If God needed to do this, how much more should we? This makes sense. So 6 days of work of creating, and then this holy day set apart that is marked by rest. Now, I don't want any of us to get caught up in the weeds yet of just how many days, like what is that ratio of work to rest? Although we're gonna learn about that as well. We'll even talk a little bit about it today. But for now, I just want you to see very simple. There's work, and then there's rest. There's work, and then there's rest. But depending on your history, the kind of family you grew up in, whether you grew up in the church or not, you may think a whole bunch of different things about this issue, right? You may have a lot of thoughts. But the older I get, and the more I talk to my friends who are also getting older with me, the more I see this universal truth that we start to value naps a lot more. Come on, anybody else with me on this, right? Like when you're 20, you're like, I don't need a nap ever, right? I'll rest when I'm dead. And then you don't need to get too many years or decades kind of past that, and you're like, I could sure go for a nap right now, right? And so we value rest, we value naps after work, and even sometimes to break up work. I love this image I found. Check this out. Have you ever done that? Let me ask more specific. You don't have to raise your hand or say anything, but just think about this. Have you ever drooled on your desk? Right? Now, some of you who know me, maybe you've been into my office, you're like, oh, Rob, you are set up perfect for this because you have that big, comfortable couch in your office, right? You sit on it and kind of sink in. Oh, it's awesome. I have a confession to make because I want to teach you guys and encourage you guys to rest. Over the almost 8 years that I have been here, I have taken a little nap on that couch 2 times or less. I know. Very, very discouraging. So I do want to promise you that over the next 8 years, I am going to obliterate that number. Right? I'm going to take way more naps on my couch in the coming years. Now, so there's a starting. Now, I want to add a little bit more to our understanding before we do some important building. So here is the first part of our second verse, Leviticus 23:3. Leviticus 23:3. This is given to God's people after the fall, so this continues, right? It doesn't go away. Sometimes we're like, well, here's God's intent, and then we messed everything up, so He's like, we're not going to do that anymore. No. This continues. We just see it in a little more detail. So Leviticus 23:3, the first part says, there are 6 days when you may work, but the 7th day is a day of, I love how these two words go together, Sabbath rest, a day of sacred assembly. So here we see God's people are permitted to work as much as they want and as hard as they want for 6 days of the week. And then they are commanded to take the 7th day as a Sabbath. And the Sabbath is marked by 2 things, right? The first one, or the second one says sacred assembly. Sacred assembly. What do you think sacred assembly refers to? Church, right? Worship. Now, we use terms like that. I'm going to worship God, or I'm going to go to church. We don't typically look at a friend or family member or neighbor and say, hey, I'm going to go to sacred assembly tomorrow, right? That's not how that typically comes out. But that makes sense, right? We know that. And then the second thing that this is to be marked by, according to Leviticus 23:3, is what else? We've been talking about it the whole time. Rest, right? It's rest. So this idea that we would have church, that would mark Sabbath, but also rest. Rest is much easier to understand, but we typically don't do a very good job of executing on that, right? We're not very good at resting. So here's a picture of the first one of those from a couple weeks ago, right? Our sacred assembly. Check this picture out. I love that. Bethany took this picture sitting right there, and so we just see one row. So there's her stepdad and her mom and Christopher. Angie, like the boom, right? Like we see that one row. Actually, Tiki's head is right by Michael's ear. You can see that there. But it's just kind of one row of us. But this idea of gathering together. Michael, Bethany's stepdad, some of you know this, was diagnosed a year or so ago with esophageal cancer, which is one of the two kinds of cancers you don't want to be diagnosed with. The treatment sort of ceased to work, so they actually put him on some experimental stuff, which wasn't working, and the oncologist who he's going to be meeting, actually coming up here pretty quick, has like one other plan or option. But they were supposed to, the weekend they were here, they were actually supposed to be in Azerbaijan visiting Bethany's sister, who's a missionary, who just had a baby. And so they were on their way. They were on their way to the airport and stopped at a follow-up doctor's appointment. And the test he had just had, they discovered, A, he was in AFib. His heart was out of rhythm, which is a no-no to fly like that. And he had a blood clot right by his port. And both of those things together are like, you can't fly. And he was feeling weaker. Here's a man in his early to mid-50s who's just like, not feeling how he's supposed to feel. So please, if you think about it, if it occurs to you, if you'd pray for him, we would love and appreciate that. Because this is important, right? There's something powerful about weekly worship. There's something powerful about weekly learning, right? When we come together and learn things, there's something powerful about weekly community. When we as God's people come together, there's something powerful about sacramental living. When there's a body of people who would share in communion together and celebrate baptism together and just learn and pray for one another and read the scriptures together, right? There's something powerful about that. Even me asking you to pray for my extended family. There's power in this. And here's why. Because as we lean into community, as we lean into each other, as we lean into these things, you and I more and more become the people of God that He created and called us to be. We don't just become the people of God because we prayed a prayer one time and then sit at home even with our Bible, right? There is no reading of the Scriptures that would lead anyone to any other conclusion than this. Faith is a team sport. It is not an individual sport. Sometimes people are like, well, Rob, I get some of that, but my faith is a personal thing. It's a private thing for me. No. If you want to live that way, your faith at its best will be stalled. You have got to lean into community. You've got to lean into the sacred assembly. In fact, Hebrews 10:25 tells us this, right? Do not forsake the assembling of yourselves together. Do not forsake getting together with others, as some are in the habit of doing. This is a powerful thing if we live it and live it consistently. Now, the rest component in Sabbath is a little more tricky. We already established adults like naps, right? But depending on the home you grew up in, you may still be living with some level or measure of bitterness in your heart over the fact that all of your friends who weren't churchgoers were able to go play, and you were sort of forced to not be a part of that on Sunday. Right? Can anyone relate to that? Right? Some of you can. Now, does anyone remember a time when literally nothing was open on Sunday? Right? When you couldn't, like there was no such thing as going out to lunch after church because every restaurant, not just Chick-fil-A, every restaurant was closed, right? You couldn't even get gas on Sunday, so you better get gas on Saturday. It wasn't even all that long ago. I remember speaking at a retreat in Kentwood, Michigan. I pulled in my car on fumes just in time to hop on the bus to go to the retreat center. We got back really late Saturday night, so Sunday morning I'm getting ready to drive home, and I went to a whole bunch of gas stations. They were all closed. I just as an answer to prayer, I think I found a gas station that was run by somebody who worships the devil, and it was open. Thank God. So I got that. So back then, which again really wasn't even all that long ago, what would you do on Sunday or on the Sabbath? You would go to church, You would go home, you would have some food, right? You would eat lunch, and then you rested. And that may look like a number of things, right? It may look like we turn the lights off and draw the curtains. It may look like, you laying quietly in bed. And it's really generally marked, especially if you're a child, by this state of being ticked off that you were not at all tired, but that you could not play with your siblings or your friends because you had to keep this important rule or even command, right? Right? Come on, we don't like that, right? And if the goal is to rest, is that kid that I just described, do they end up more rested after being made into a hostage? No, right? In fact, they're ticked off and they're probably more exhausted. Check out this picture. Toddler sleep problems or typical toddler behavior. For us, that's sort of like Liam, when we look at Liam, our 5-year-old, and say, hey buddy, we're going to do a quiet rest or quiet watching. And he just sort of looks at us like, what are you talking about? I am not at all tired. And then from there, it may actually devolve into something a lot more nasty and sinister. But for some of you, if you're old school, right, you might be like, but Rob, it really doesn't matter because it's right there in black and white on the pages of every single Bible ever written. And in fact, the second portion of Leviticus 23:3, after mentioning Sabbath rest and sacred assembly, drives this point home even more clearly. Check it out. You are not to do any work. Wherever you live, it is a Sabbath to the Lord. No work. No matter where you live, whatever the location is or the time in history, it doesn't matter. If you live in a city or you live in the country, doesn't matter, right? No work, no matter where you live, for this is your obedient and required gift to God. This is a Sabbath to the Lord. That's what the text clearly says. And some of us are like, they did it. We used to do it. I know we've strayed a long way from that, but we need to get back to it, right, Rob? Well, maybe, but here's something I think you need to know. Piece of information that's key here. When we're thinking about the people of God and the scriptures and sort of even biblically, they cheated. They cheated. Now some of you are like, what do you mean? What are you talking about? Exodus 16:9 gives us the command that for the people of God, the children of Israel, the Jewish people, right, gives the command that on the Sabbath, you are not to leave your home. Right? On the Sabbath, you can't go anywhere. You got to stay in your homes. But rabbis over time actually stretched that a little bit to say, you know what, there's this Old Testament concept where when the people of God were following the priests who were carrying the Ark of the Covenant that marked the presence of God, they weren't allowed to get more than 2,000 cubits from the Ark because it was dangerous to be any closer to the presence of God. So now, since we're past that, that is the temple sort of represents the presence of God. So any good Jew should be within 2,000 cubits of the temple on the Sabbath. And so that should be the farthest you ever go on the Sabbath. So it went from don't leave your house to you can go 2,000 cubits up to that and still sort of qualify. For some rabbis, because some of you are like, what in the world is a cubit? Right? Well, for some rabbis, a cubit was 1 foot 6 inches. For other rabbis, they said, no. A cubit is 1 foot 9 inches. So some people were allowed to go about 3,000 feet, and other people were allowed to go up to 3,600 feet on the Sabbath and still qualify. And remember, the black and white words of the scriptures tell us don't go anywhere on the Sabbath, right? That's why for many of you, your parents locked you in the house when you were growing up. Because that's what the Bible says, that's what we're going to do. But in the Jewish people, what the rabbi said is, no, you can sort of do up to this. But if you had one rabbi, that meant you could go this far. And if you had another rabbi, it meant you could go this far. For some of you, if you were more energetic, right, or younger, you might go, I want a rabbi who says 3,600 feet. For others of you, if you're older or your joints hurt more, you're like, no, 3,000 feet's plenty for me, right? I don't have to go any further than I have to on the Sabbath because it's to honor God, right? So these are all interpretive additions. This isn't what the Bible says. These are interpretive additions that have been added. But what do you do if you're a faithful follower of God, but you want or even need to go further than that? It's about half a mile you could go. What if you wanted or needed to go further than that half mile? Well, there was a way around that too. You could actually, as long as you did it before the Sabbath, because there was no doing it on the Sabbath, you could go a half mile and you could leave some food. So that the night before, the day before, whatever, you could leave some food so that when you got to that mark and stopped and ate the food, that would actually qualify, that would mark that spot as being your domicile or your temporary house, which would then allow you to go another half mile. And some people say that you could do that multiple times to kind of get as far as you wanted to go. And sometimes you could leave food, maybe sometimes you could even leave a possession of yours, hide it in the bushes or alongside the road so that you could go as far as you wanted. Now some of you are like, wow, if that's really true, it sounds like we could probably just do whatever the heck we want, right? But I wouldn't go that far because here's the thing. I told you they were cheating, but I said that a little bit tongue-in-cheek because in their hearts and minds, they actually believed they were following the rules. The rules allowed for this, and they took advantage of that, but they really believed they're following the rules. And in some ways, like we would look at all that extra work of going out the day before and placing all those things, like we go, that's dumb, right? That's foolish. Who would do all that? But doesn't that extra work keep us honest? So instead of just saying, I don't like the rule, it's inconvenient for me today, so I just won't follow it today like we do, doesn't it make sense that by doing that, we're like, you know what, if I really don't have to travel, if I really don't have to spend that energy, then I'm not going to do it, right? That's what sort of that pushes into. So now that we have this common foundation, I just want to do a little bit of building on it for our last number of minutes. And I want to enter this portion by giving you two of my favorite definitions from scholars and pastors of Sabbath. So here's the first one. Sabbath, glad and good activities that are so captivating, they remind me I'm cherished by God and release me from my duty for a while. I'm going to read both of these twice. But let me encourage you, write this down. Maybe if you have a smartphone, take your phone out and snap a picture of that. If you don't have or don't want to do either of those, I will actually post both of these definition slides on my Facebook page and on the church Facebook page this afternoon so you can have access to them that way. But listen to this again. Such a great, like we have this definition, so now we're starting this redefinition, right? What does rest really mean? What does Sabbath really mean? So Sabbath, glad and good activities that are so captivating. They remind me I'm cherished by God and that I'm released from my duty for just a little while. Now let me give you the second definition. I actually kind of like this one even more. Sabbath, any activity under the sun that gives you the greatest joy and God the greatest glory. I'm going to read it again, but I want you to focus on those two components, right? You the greatest joy, God the greatest glory, but do not miss the key word, which is the word and. It's not just, I love this the most, so I'll just, no. It's both of these things, right? So again, Sabbath, any activity at all under the sun that gives you the greatest joy and God the greatest glory. So let's continue with rest redefined, right? We have a common starting point. We have some new and helpful information, these new definitions of what Sabbath can and maybe does and should look like. And so just like the ticked off kid, right? Who can't go clay is probably less rested. And just like the Jews figured out this lawful way to move about when necessary, and just like many of us actually, maybe we didn't used to believe this or thought differently, but many of us now believe it's a good thing restaurants are open, because when we can go grab a bite somewhere, we actually are more rested and get to do less work. Now, some of you are old school. You're like, no, because for me to do that means that other people have to work. So that's not right. You know what? If you really feel that strongly about that, what about me? Right? Like, oh, no, I shouldn't do something that makes someone work on the Sabbath. Come on, right? In some ways, servers are like pastors. They serve us, and they need a different time that is Sabbath for them or rest for them. So maybe, just maybe, there is a better way to apply this truth so that it gives us life and rest instead of robbing life from us. Right? Because life-robbing rules, I don't think, are what God ever intends. So I want to give you, as we end, 4 things, very simple, that we should think about and we should live out as we redefine what Sabbath and rest should look like in our lives. If we really want to truly experience rest. So here's the first one. First one is different. Different. Pretty simple, right? Different. One day, at least one day of the week should look different for you than the other 6. Pretty simple, right? Because here's the thing. Too much sameness wears us out. Change things up. Don't just do the same thing over and over and over and over again forever. If you're married, this is actually a good thing to apply to the intimate areas of your life, too. That's just a freebie. Tuck it away. You're welcome. When it comes to work, don't just power through, push harder, get it all done, right? We'll rest when we get to the other side. Do not do that. Instead, keep this rhythm of work and rest and work and rest. And I'm going to work 6 days and I'm going to rest 1. Keep this rhythm, trusting in the end it will add up to way more than just working harder. And we're going to really hit this next week. Your eyes are literally going to be blown out of your minds next week as you see how we can actually accomplish more through less. And before you jump in with all your excuses why this just won't work for you, or giving me the but, right? I'm only suggesting 1/7. That's it. I'm not saying 50-50 or even 25%, just 1/7. And as much as the specific day may not matter depending on your job or your schedule or whatever, I will say this, make it as consistent as possible. Don't say, well, this week my Sabbath's going to be this day and next week it's going to be here, and have it like it should be kind of this pattern of days where you work and then a day of Sabbath. So different. Here's the second one. Captivating. Or another word here is joy. Just like jailing our kids in their rooms is not helpful for them becoming lifelong followers of Jesus, neither is forcing us to follow poorly interpreted rules that make us miserable. That doesn't give us any rest. I did what I was supposed to, right? Like, no, that doesn't give us rest. Do the things that remind you just how loved and cherished you are by God. If what you do on the Sabbath is more a reminder that you have some overbearing heavenly parent than it is a reminder that you are loved and cherished by God, you probably need to do different things on the Sabbath, on your Sabbath. Now, some of you are like, yes, I am so glad you shared this today. Because Rob, for me, the thing that is just like the best for me is outdoors time. So what I've decided is turkey season starts here in the coming weeks. So it was good to be at church today. Love you. Happy Easter. But turkey season, I'm going to be out in the woods, me and Jesus, because that's what I do. And then when turkey season ends, then I'm going to shift into golfing season or maybe fishing season and kind of do that for the summer because that's my best way to connect with Jesus, right? And then when that comes to an end, starts winding down, then I'm going to do deer hunting season because that's when that picks up. And then at the end of deer hunting season, when it gets cold and nobody wants to be outside anyway, then I'll see you back at church. Thank you so much. Except, we can't just take one of these concepts and then another concept. These all work together, right? So here's the third one, which kind of builds and kind of blows up your plan. Good plan, but it kind of messes with it a little bit. It's this. Our rest, our Sabbath, has got to be God-honoring. If you honor God with your life and live His way, He will give you rest. As I was writing these words this week, I did some looking back. And I think I've probably made that statement dozens of times in the last year or so. And actually I started to feel a little guilty about that. Some of you were like, I'm really glad you feel that way, right? Because it's like we come to church, we want to learn some new things. We want to get some new information. We're tired of hearing that thing over and over. We've heard it already, Rob, a whole bunch of times. Give us some fresh material, right? Except I always go back in my mind to a conversation I had with someone one time. I was beginning to journey with him through a pretty messy divorce. And in our first meeting, I looked him in the eyes and I said, tell me what happened. And here's what he said to me. I kid you not. He said, we just didn't do all the stuff you tell us to do every single week. Oh, so maybe sometimes the things that are most important, we need to hear and we need to say over and over and over again, right? And over. And maybe even over. Do things that give you the greatest joy and bring God the greatest glory. Would it make any sense for you and I to consistently skip out on learning about Him and worshiping Him and gathering with His people and still feel as though you and I were honoring Him with our life? It doesn't, does it? Oh God, I love you. I'm there for you. I just am never going to do any of the things that help develop that. And just like God can do more with 90% of your money, right? Than you can do with 100. This same thing applies to our time and our energy and our effort in our rest. When we trust God, more comes of that. Some of you said to Bethany and I, man, we just love your kids. Your kids are so great. And part of it's like, we're like, you don't really fully know our kids then. But part of us is like, yeah, they're great kids. And all of you intuitively know, you're like, well, it's probably not, any credit to Rob, but a lot of credit to Bethany, which you would be completely right about that. But I would say even more than that, because Bethany's a great mom. But it's because we have consistently and in many ways daily and certainly weekly exposed them to Jesus. Jesus makes way bigger difference even than Bethany can, right? This is so unbelievably important. I was thinking about this. We need to do it. We need to live life His way. I was just thinking about this idea of faithfulness and fidelity to God. See, anytime I've talked to someone, and it hasn't happened a ton, but you talk to someone and they tell you that they're married, but that there's someone else as well. And I just be honest, especially as I get older and have less energy, my first thought is this: oh, that just seems like a lot of work to manage that. Right? Like it's hard enough to remember all the details and things and keep one name straight. When you add a whole other person instead of details and name into the mix, you're like, your chances of failure are exponentially higher. And even just, not even my own life, but just thinking about that in someone else's life makes me tired. But some of us, this is our experience with church, right? Like for some of you, you're like, oh man, it was a great week at church because, man, Rob really let me have it. Man, God really convicted me. Oh man, that was a tough one. Yep, they talked about all this messed up stuff in my life. Absolutely, right? That's okay every now and then. But if you feel that every week or every time you're in church, you need to start living your life a little different, right? Like it shouldn't always be this way. There should be some things where you're like, hey, I'm doing better at that. I'm actually doing well at that. Because here's the thing, if every week it's like, oh, there's another area I got to work on and another area I got to work on, guess what happens? You're going to always be exhausted. So when we live faithful lives to God, we just experience rest. So much better. All right, here's the last one. And this actually may be the hardest. It's the most simple, but it may be the hardest. Make sure your Sabbath is marked not by work, but by rest. Don't just apply the different rule, right? Well, it's different, so as long as it's different, doesn't matter if it's a different kind of work, right? Don't do that. Don't say, well, it's not my day job I did the other 6 days, so today I'm going to just work at home. No, because that is not Sabbath, and it will not result in rest. But, and we're pretty much done, but what is work for one person may not be work for someone else, right? So this is where you've got to be wise and say, God, who have you made me to be? And what gives joy to my soul? And what is work? So like for some of you, the idea of cutting your grass, getting the lawnmower out, fueling it up, pushing it around, riding on it, whatever, you're like, oh, I'd rather be laying on the lawn under the lawnmower than do that. If that's how you feel, probably cutting your grass on the Sabbath is a bad thing to do. But for some of you, you're like, man, it's peace and quiet. I can listen to music. I don't have to hear my kids for like that period. Like what? It's like, it is like life-giving and restful. If that's you, cut your grass, right? I remember when I started in high school downhill skiing. And I remember the first couple times going down the big hill, and I literally had like the fear of God, like I am going to die, seizing my body the whole time. If that's how you feel, that might be a bad Sabbath activity. But I'll tell you, as I got good at it, I was skiing in British Columbia one time, and I was standing on the peak of a rocky mountain. And everywhere I looked in every direction were other Rocky Mountain peaks, snow-covered. And it was one of the most awe-inspiring, significant moments in my entire life. What a great thing to do on the Sabbath. For some of you, the idea of being out on the golf course, right? And hitting a nice drive down the fairway and hitting an approach shot into the green and just the smell of that freshly cut and manicured lawn everywhere and just being out in nature, you're like, that just does it for me. For others of you, you get back from golfing and you're like, oh, my wrists are sore from smacking the club into the ground and almost breaking my wrist on every single shot. And it not only cost me all the money to play golf, but I spent at least that much launching balls into water hazards and woods, right? And it's like the most aggravating and frustrating thing you ever could do. Guess what? Probably it's a bad Sabbath activity. Or even stuff we do around here all the time, right? Like going for a hike or a mountain bike ride. Guess what? If being out in nature and walking along just like connects you to Jesus, do that. If you're like, I start walking up one of those hills in Mohican and I feel like I'm going to be taking a dirt nap any minute because I'm having a cardiac episode, probably not, that's not a good Sabbath activity for you. What God-honoring thing reminds you that you are released from your burden for a while? What brings joy and rest to your soul? So today, just wanted to lay that foundation that we could build from these next few weeks for the rest of the month. And in some ways, I wanted to set you free, right? Like I used to think about it this way and do all that. I wanted you to be set free. And in some ways, hopefully God has made you start to think. So as we end today, a question. Will you redefine what rest looks like in your life? instead of thinking it looks like this miserable following of a whole bunch of rules, here's the thing. If you really redefine it, right, you get to do something different and fresh and brand new. You get to pick a different thing that captivates you and brings joy to your soul. You get to do that kind of stuff and at the exact same time honor God, right? So you are refreshed and happy and God is honored at the same time. And the amazing thing is that this is not work, but it is rest and gives you rest. This is called Sabbath. And when we practice it, it always results in rest. So for me, sometimes Sabbath looks like going out with some buddies, eating way too many chicken wings, and talking about Jesus. I'm actually looking at you because I think you and I have eaten more chicken wings together than me and everybody else in here put together. Amen. Sometimes Sabbath, church, can look like golf with a friend. I actually have a friend here at church who probably 75% or more of the golf I play is with them. And we have a blast. Turkey season's coming up in a couple of weeks, and I do want you to know that after we get past Easter, I will be armed and camouflaged in the woods trying to eat some turkey, right? And I'll be doing it with a person I love, and it'll be great. And here's the thing, because I do work on Sundays pretty much every single Sunday of the year. I know, right? Crazy. At least you got one day where you work. For me, Friday is not just my day off. It's my Sabbath, right? Where if you text me or message me, or the likelihood of me getting it at all on Friday is very low because I am resting and I'm hanging out with Jesus and I'm practicing this every Friday. And so God, I thank you for this foundation. I thank you for this simple truth. I thank you for this opportunity to just in some slight but significant ways redefine what rest has looked like and will look like in our lives going forward. So God, today I simply pray in a world, in a room full of people who many of us are living in a place of exhaustion with desperate need for rest. God, I pray that you would help us to take steps in this direction. And God, that doing so would immediately be reinforced for us. And we would see that when we live this way, it makes every single day a glorious day. Give us this experience, we ask in Jesus' name. Amen.